Welcome to labness.com in a lab video series on Cisco ACI. This is Metha, your instructor for this video series. For a complete list of ACI videos, you can visit our website under the Data Center section. There you can also sign up for our newsletters to receive the latest video updates. When it comes to configuring and managing ACI, you have several options, and these include Web GUI, Command Line, REST API, or Cobra SDK. But one of the most popular options, and probably what most of us use when start learning ACI and maybe even for a day-to-day operation, is the web interface. So in this video, we are going to walk you through the GUI on our APIC. The goal is to familiarize yourself with the layout of the web interface and see what are available for you to configure. Our lab setup is identical to what we did in the last video with the fabric provisioning. We have two spine switches, spine 1 and 2, and 4 leaf switches, leaf 1, 2, 3, and 4, all fully discovered, added to the fabric. Then we have a cluster of 3 APIC servers, APIC 1, 2, and 3. They're all due home to leaf 1 and 2. And on the management side, there's connections to the outbound management. On the VLAN 99, that's on the management switch, switch 1. Right, with the subnet 172.16.99.0/24 and the IP of APIC number 1, which is the APIC we're going to mainly use for pretty much most of our configuration, is the IP of .11. On another VLAN, VLAN 32, it's where our Windows 2012 RDP jump box is sitting, and that's where we will access the web interface from. All right, the IP of 32.40, and we'll be accessing 99.11. Using APIC GUI is probably the easiest way to learn ACI. Not only that you use the GUI for day-to-day configuration, you also use it to monitor and troubleshoot your ACI deployment. Now, prior to version 3.0, there used to be two flavors of web interface, which are the basic and the advanced. In 3.0, basic GUI has been deprecated, although there's a hidden link or a URL that you can get there, and this is all listed in the release notes, although I'm not going to show you that because you're pretty much discouraged to use the basic web interface. And to be honest with you, I personally never actually used the basic GUI anyway, as Cisco said that the mixed configuration between the basic and the advanced GUI is a bad idea. So I've always used the advanced GUI, and if you are running older version, I would advise you to do the same. Right? Since when you bring up the web interface right here, there will be like a drop down and said, do you want to log into the advanced or basic? Right? I would say just always use the advanced GUI. And that's going to be what our web interface is going to be based on anyway, the advanced GUI. But as you can see right here, version 3.0, there's no drop down anymore. Right? If to access the basic GUI, you need to provide a very specific URL. Now let's log into the GUI, although we kind of saw that, give you a sneak preview in the last video when we did the fabric discovery and provisioning. But we only saw like a small section of the entire GUI, which was under the fabric and the fabric membership. Now we're going to go over the APIC GUI as a whole. Once you log in, you see the GUI is divided up into different sections. At the top, you have the menus, right, the main menu, which are listed right here, and then you have the toolbar or tool icons on the top right-hand corner. The menu is the main configuration section. Under each menu, you have a sub-menu. As we're in right now, the system menu, and then you have this bunch of sub-menus right here. And under the sub-menu, depending on if you're on the configuration or monitoring page, the layout might be a little different. Like right here, we're in the dashboard, so I guess it's kind of monitoring. But if you switch over to things like fabric and fabric policy, then you'll be in like configuration mode or page. Let's go back to the dashboard. And the first thing that you see, or the page that you see after logging into the APIC, is called Dashboard. This gives you a quick snapshot of the system health. As you can see right here, currently we're at 100, and that's the number that you want to be as close to as possible. The lower value obviously implies that there are more faults that you have in the system, and there's different level of faults, and we'll mention that throughout the video series. Right? One is more important than the other, and the list of faults is right here. These are the fault counts table, And the severity increases from right to left, and it's also color-coded as well. Red is obviously bad, so you probably don't want to see anything in this column. I believe the orange one is the major fault, yellow is minor fault, and then the green one is probably warning, right? And the red one being critical. Now, going back to the health graph, it gives you the historical health score. You can see that the x-axis are the time, and over time, your health or system health can deteriorate it or recovered from any failure. And since I just recorded the Fabric discovery or provisioning videos, you can see that it started off close to 0 when there's no switches, and then as we introduce a switch to the system and completing the 3-node clusters, it become pretty close to 100. Actually, it's 100 right now. Right underneath the system health, you have the node and tenant health filters. This tells you which nodes and tenant needs the most attention. Right now, we don't have anything with the health score below or equal to 99, which means that there's nothing that we need to worry about. Right, but you can adjust the health score right here, and this is the health score filter. And this is again based on node, which is the hardware switches, and the tenant. On the right-hand side, I already mentioned there's a breakdown of faults by domain and type. And you can drill down into this by clicking into it. Like, for example, since this is the only one that we have right now, let me click into that, and it will take you to another submenu, faults, which lists out all the faults that exist in the system right now. Okay, we go back. And the bottom right-hand corner is the controller status. It should always be green with the health state of fully fit. And that's the dashboard page. Then we can go to, let's go back to the left, which is quick starts. Throughout different configuration pages, you may see menu linked to Quick Start, which is the wizard type of configuration process. I personally tend to stay away from it, as sometimes it creates components that might already exist or use its own naming convention that you don't really want because you have your own naming convention going on already. It's certainly a good learning tool, but as you become more competent with the system, you might not want to use this guy anymore. All right, so this page right here is the main Quick Start that guides you through the entire system configuration. You can use it as reference or link to some other relevant pages. You see there's some quick links over here depending on what you want to do. There's some summary, and when you say caution, you might want to read it. So it said Cisco recommend not to mix advanced and basic, just like how I mentioned earlier. And the steps columns right here just walks you through or gives you an idea of the order of configuration you want to perform, right? First thing, to initialize the fabric, and that's exactly what we did in the last video. And then it recommends you do things like create user accounts and connect to VM systems and things like that. All right, now let's go to the controller. We were in here in the last video during the fabric provisioning. We use it to validate the status of our controller. This is where you can find pretty much everything about the APIC servers themselves. Right, from the topology, the status, and configuration in the hardware health and all that. And by the way, most of the pages you see on APIC will look something like this in terms of a page partition. On the left-hand pane, this is what's called a navigation pane. It has a hierarchical menu that you can just keep expanding or collapsing. All right, like this guy right here, controller, we went to this particular APIC 1 node, and then let's see, power supply expanded to 5 and 6. If the object is configurable, it will support a right-clicking. Well, even these guys, even though it's not configurable, we can save it and do a bunch of stuff that's related to API on it. But yeah, like this guy has nothing to configure. Let's see. Yep, they're all pretty much read-only. And I'll show you, it'll come up sooner than later. You can right-click and then perform whatever actions that's available. And then the right-hand side of the page is called a work pane. And this is where you either view the configuration or perform the configurations themselves. Yep, like right here. Yep, you can provide descriptions and select policies, and that's basically some of the configuration that you can do. All right, we're not going to repeat this because we went through that already. Although, let me show this real quick. I don't think I showed this page in the last video. So when you click on the interface, it gives you a breakdown of the interfaces available on the APIC server. 2122s are the two 10 gig ports on the 10 gig VIC, and then Ethernet 1 and 1.1 and 1.2, that is the 1 gig out-of-band management link, right? And they're both aggregated together into a bonded interface. So bond 0 is the 10 gig connect to the fabric, and the bond 1 is also aggregated into an active standby to the out-of-band switch, so they're fully redundant. You can see that the bond 0 has a subinterface of 100, and that's where I believe the IP that was assigned, 100.1, is a subinterface VLAN 100, and that's the infrastructure VLAN we provide during the APIC initialization. All right, going to system settings. I don't believe this submenu right here was there in the previous version. When I say previous version, it means 2.x or earlier. This menu used to be in a Fabric policy page, I believe, which is under Fabric. I'm just going to go through some menu options that are global, while the rest we will revisit in the future when we get to the relevant features configuration. Maybe we'll start with the BGP route reflector. I mentioned back in the ACI introduction video that ACI uses MPBGP to distribute the external layer 3 routes from the border leaf to the rest of the fabric. This is where you specify the BGP route reflector, which are usually the spine. And we'll come back and take a look at this when we deal with the L3 out video, right? When we're ready to accept the external route or run the routing protocol to the external layer 3 network. This is where you configure the route reflector. Control plane MTU, it's 9000 by default, and this is the MTU for the fabric. The default value of 9000 is actually maximum, so if you keep increasing, you can see it doesn't go up anymore. Yep, so just FYI, your fabric has MTU of 9000. COOP group. Yep, so COOP or Council of Oracle Protocol is a protocol that's used by the leaf and the spine to send the endpoint mapping or exchange the endpoint mapping. Right, so the leaf sends the mapping to the spine acting as a proxy. Here you have two options, the compatible or strict. Strict being that you want to perform MD5 authentication between the switches, and the compatible means that both MD5 and non-authenticated connections will be accepted. Right, and by default, we're good with compatible type. Just want to mention that. Let's see, I'm skipping around a little bit here. I'm just trying to pick out the one that's relevant for us right now. Endpoint control. This is the way to provide the fabric with loop protection. It deals with the MAC address flappings. Right, so MAC address flappings can happen, and when the endpoint keeps switching the ports or showed up on two different ports in a fast interval, by default it's disabled. All right, so if you want to enable loop protection, they can switch to enable. 60-second detection by default, multiplication factor of 4, and what happens in the flapping is detected by default, we disable the port. Yep, and actually it said EP loop protections right here. All right, then you have the next tab over is IP aging. The ACI sends ARP to check for IPs and remove endpoint if there's no reply from that IP address. This is pretty much like an endpoint tracking mechanism, and by default it is disabled. Right, you can switch it over right here. And by the way, if you're not sure what the configuration is for, there's a little question mark, which is the link to the help page that you can bring up a guide, and it gives you a more descriptive explanation of what the configuration is about. And I find this to be very helpful, because obviously when you go through the configuration, you may or may not know all of the configurable options, and sometimes the naming is not very obvious exactly what it does. So this link right here comes to the rescue quite a bit. Okay, let me see what other menu here that I want to go over. We'll keep that for later. Maybe fabric-wise settings. There's just some more advanced knobs that you can tune or fine-tune, and I would say just leave that alone. Right, like disable endpoint learning, reallocate GIPO, enforce domain validation. We'll just leave that. We said route reflector, we covered that. Load balancer. And this refers how the switches distribute the load amongst the available uplinks. You can see that each of the leaf switches, or even the spine, they have multiple connections to the neighbors. All right, for example, the sleeps right here has two uplinks they can choose from to send traffic to the two spines. Traditionally, this is based on ECMP or equal cost multipath, but you can adjust it to take into account congestion and flow size. I can see dynamic load balancing mode, aggressive, conservative. packet prioritization, and load balancing mode. Yep. There. I would just say, unless you know exactly what you're doing here, I would just leave it at the default. Next menu over is faults. It's just give you a list of all the system faults, and we were on this page earlier when we click the link on the dashboard page under the fault table. We'll come here to investigate issue from time to time when something doesn't work, and it's just going to become pretty much almost a second nature to you. All right, to keep checking faults and make sure there's no red flags or anything. Config zones. You can use zones to control configuration changes to the fabric. You can partition your fabric switches to include them into different zones. Instead of having the change to take effects fabric-wide, when you make whatever changes on the APIC GUI, you can first apply to a group of pods or switches in a zones, just to kind of test that out, the config first, before you push it to the rest of the fabric. All right, we have a video showing you how this feature works. Events, just a list of system events that the APIC maintain. Yep, you can see up down is almost like a log page. The physical interface, up down, power supply detectors, and things like that. Audit log is the log of configuration changes that has been performed by the user. So you can see when we did the node discovery, that's obviously part of the config changes, and they're listed right here. The next menu over is tenant. Anything configured under tenants are logical configuration components that we discussed back in the ACI introduction video. And by default, there are 3 tenants. There are common, infra, and management. You can also create your own tenants by clicking on this tool icon drop down and say create tenants. And most of the configuration options under the tenants are the same. We can click into the common just to show you what's different are the purpose of the tenants. Okay, like the common one, it's pretty much any resources or services that you want to be able to share with other tenants. This is where it should be created. All right, common tenant. And this could be firewall, load balancer, or logical objects like VRF, bridge domain, subnets, or contracts. In one of the future videos, I believe we will be using common tenants as part of the tenants design and configuration. You'll see how that works. Then you have the infra or infrastructure tenants, and this is reserved for operations of the fabric infrastructures. For the most part, you wouldn't need to do anything under the tenant here. And there's a special circumstance, like when you want to connect to the external IPN for extending fabric and things like that, where you might want to come in and perform the configuration here. Otherwise, I would say for a regular ACI deployment, you would need to do anything here. Then you have the last default tenant, which is management. Management is where you configure either in-band or out-of-band access to the fabric. And this is to allow things like HTTPS, SSH access to the APIC and the spine and leaf. And we're definitely going to have dedicated videos covering out-of-band access, or out-of-band management, and in-band management. All right, those are the 2 supported type of management in ACI. Let me go back to the common tenant real quick, and just to show you some of the things that you can configure under the tenant. Like I said, the menu options under here will be pretty much identical across all types of tenants, whether it's the defaults or user custom ones. All right, you got application profile. Remember, we discussed about that. It's a group of EPG, and under there, obviously, you be able to create EPG right here. Create application EPGs. Networking, you got the bridge domain, VRF. External bridge network, or L2 out. External routed network, or L3 out. Any protocols that you want to run within the tenants. IP pool, security policies that deals with contracts and all the relevant components that makes up of a contract. Ability to troubleshoot stuff with the span ports, trace routes, atomic counter. Configuration of monitoring policy, and L4, L7 service templates and NetFlow. All right, that should give you some ideas. All right, so tenant was for logical configuration, and for the physical configuration, it will be under the fabric menu. It's starting with the submenu of inventory. This is where we were in the last video to perform fabric provisioning and discovery. Right in the topology, it gives you a quick view of the fabric and some access to port configuration. Right under the configure tab right here. For the topology is the view of the fabric physical topology. We saw that in the last video. For the global endpoints, it gives you a list of endpoint the fabric knows about, because every time the new endpoint gets added to the fabric detects it and maintains the database of that, and that's where you come in and look at that. If your endpoint doesn't show up in this table right here, the chances are it's not going to be able to communicate. Configure is a way to graphically configure your switch port, and you can start by adding some switches and then configure the ports, although I don't come to use this as much, as sometimes the configuration that gets generated as a result of that tends to be a little bit messy. Interfaces and policies, a quick view to see what policy ties to an interface. We don't have anything configured yet, so that's why it's blank. Yep, then we have pod 1, which is the only pod that we have in our deployment right now. It allows you to get all the detailed information of all the different switches. Again, we looked at this in the last video after we fully brought up the fabric. You get all the submenus, you can go to the leaf, and then there's different tabs you can go through. Topology, configure general, and more options. For the pod fabric setup policy, this is where you can come in and create additional pod or set up a multi-pod. As you can see, set up pod, multi-pod, run it outside the multi-pod. You can also see the VTEP pool that we assign to or give to the APIC as well. Yep, was A216.100/22. The fabric membership, we looked at that in the last video and performed fabric discovery. It just shows you all the list of all the fabric switches, spine or leaf. So I'm going to skip that. Unmanaged fabric node. This is external switches that connect to ACI fabric but not being managed by ACI, and it's probably used the protocol like CDP LLDP to discover external switches, and they'll be listed right here if it's being detected by one of the leaf switches. Unreachable node is any fabric switches that has been disconnected from the fabric. So we show right here, right, where there's the faulty connections or faulty hardware or the node is completely down. And that is different from the decommission switch, which is you going into the system and purposely remove the switch from the fabric by using the decommission feature. And that could be part of a regular maintenance, or you want to permanently remove the switch from the fabric. All right, then we have the fabric policies, and this is any configuration related to fabric switches themselves and the fabric port. All right, so remember the fabric ports are the ports that's facing the leaf and the spine. And some of the things you can configure here, so things like date and time, I believe is somewhere here. Yep, date and time, SNMP, network services, any switch operational settings as a whole. And we're going to have dedicated videos for this, which will go through each of these menus in more detail. And if you compare this to a traditional Cisco switches, this is probably equivalent to the global configuration of the switch, right? Like locking or syslog, SNMP, time, NTP, domain name. Right next to the fabric policy is the access policy. This is any configuration you need to configure the access port. So the name does line up. So fabric policy is for configuration for fabric port and the fabric devices themselves, and the access policy is for any endpoint facing or access ports. This corresponds to the physical configuration component we discussed in the ACI introduction video. Remember, we talked about the physical configuration where you prep the port and allow VLANs to be carried on those ports to allow packets into the EPG. If you go through each of these sections, you'll see the components that we have already covered in that video, things like VLAN pool, domain, right? AEP is under here, attachable access identity profile. And they got interface policy group profile, and the switch profile, which is right here. And we're going to have a dedicated video for this section as well. Next is VM networking. And this section here is for an integration with virtual machine system like Microsoft, OpenStack, or VMware. And we're also going to have a dedicated video for this since it's one of actually more important topics of ACI. Right, you can see the supported platforms are listed on the left. L4 to L7 services. In addition to what we saw under the tenant where you can create L4 to L7 devices, this is also a dedicated section for L4 to L7 device for keeping inventory, creating device manager types, or L4 to L7 chassis types. And most importantly, this is where you import what's called a device package, which is required if you want ACI to manage L4, L7 devices. And the device package import is right here underneath the packages link. Okay, import device package. And we'll come back and take a deeper look at this when we get to the L4, L7 services video. The next menu is the admin menu. So click into there, and the first submenu is AAA. So AAA authentication is where you want the ACI to authenticate the admin user against. And ACI support a few types of authentication, local being one, of course. That's what we're using right now, the local admin. Then you can support LDAP, Radius, TAGX, single sign-on with SAML. Then followed by a section where you can install certificates. If you no longer want to use the self-sign cert on the ACI or the APIC, right, you can install the cert right here. It's all being configured under here. Then you got the security management, which is the overall security settings of APIC. Things like security domain roles. This is where you add the local user. Currently there's a user admin. Any remote user, being where there's LDAP, Radius, TAGX user that pass authentication will be added to this list. And then RBAC. Right? So security domain is what part of the GUI, or to be exact, the managed information tree that you want the user to have access to. If you remember back in the first video, introduction video, we talked about the MIT towards the end of that video. All right, this is to give you a scope of how much of the section in that tree that you want access, the user to have access to. The role is what users are allowed to configure. Right, and roles are tied to privileges. Or is talked about local and remote user, and RBAC provides user additional access to resources in their security domain. Right, so RBAC, it's very similar to security domain, but it's very specific to a DN, right, distinguished name. So you can target a particular object and then open up access to that object for the user. I'm not going to go into detail on LDAP, Radius, TAGX, or SAML. We're going to have videos that talks about AAA configuration. We're certainly going to be covering rules and RBAC rules and all that, and how to tie the APIC to Radius and TAGX authentication. Yep, I already said the public key is for installing a certificate on the APIC, and then AES encryption passphrase. This is if you want to enforce encryptions on the configuration import or export of your APIC configuration. Then you can do it right here. Right, by default, there's no encryption being enforced. And the last menu items right here is the enabling FIPS mode, which is disabled by default. Right, scheduler. This is where you can create time schedule that can be used for other things like schedule upgrade or schedule config backup. Right, when you create this, it just allows you to pick or give it a name and how often you want certain things to run. If it's one time or is it recurring? If it's recurring, how often would that be, right, in terms of dates and time? Right, so that's scheduler. Historical records, policies. You got the controller policies, which is pretty much the database management, how long the data is being retained and purged, or how often it gets purged, right, which is defined by purge interval right here. So it's basically the backend housekeeping settings. Audit log, event retention, fault record, and health records. Switch policies under there is pretty much the same thing, but for switches. and unless you need to, I would leave them at their default value. The next menu is firmware. All right, at some point you're going to need to upgrade, hopefully not downgrade, your fabric components, and this is where you perform the software upgrade. We're definitely going to have a videos on how to show you to perform software upgrade, so we're going to go into this in more detail then. External data collector. This is where you configure call home, remote SNMP server, or syslog server. All right, it's part of the modern destination right here. So you define a server, the recipients of SNMP or syslog, and then under the fabric policy, we'll basically create a reference that points to this, depending on what you want to send to them. All right, this is just where you define the server. Configuration rollback. All right, this allows you to be able to roll back any changes that you make to the system between two snapshots or two backup files. And taking snapshots is probably something that you want to do every time you make any significant changes to the system, just so that you know that there is some place that you can revert back to. All right, so then you have the import export, which is similar to the snapshot, except that the configuration backup and restores uses the file that will be stored externally to the box. So snapshot is usually referred to the local backup files, and then the import exports deals with the remote copy of the backup file. All right, so in addition to configuration, backup, and restore, you can also use the export policy to export things like tech support files for your Cisco TAC engineers to look at. So when you troubleshoot something with Cisco TAC, they might ask you to perform a tech support export, and then upload it to them for them to review. Yep, and we'll have a dedicated video when we deal with configuration backup and restore that will talk about the rollback and the import export. Then we have the operations menu. Most of these are used for troubleshooting purposes, I would say, like visibility and troubleshooting. This is used to visualize communication between two endpoints as part of the troubleshooting. So you have to specify the type of sessions and then provide the source and destination endpoints, right? And then it will run through a different troubleshooting steps. It gives back a bunch of results where you can review and see if anything stands out that might cause the communication issue. All right, so it's definitely great for troubleshooting communication issue. Capacity dashboard. The fabric resources are definitely finite. So if your deployment is getting larger, you might want to keep an eye on these consumption of these resources. You can see VRF, bridge domain, EPG, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the physical resource. MAC address learn, multicast, the CAM, and the VLAN. So this gives you a pretty good overview of how much configuration is in place. And notice that this is mostly concerned the leaf switches, since it's where the most configuration is being rendered. Yep. And on the left, it gives you the overall capacity as opposed to per leaf nodes. All right, then we have ACI Optimizer. The optimizer configuration templates is more like a design tool, I would say, where you input all logical requirements for your design, and it turns that into a physical requirement. So it tells you how many switches and all that you would need. You can also check if the current fabric satisfy your logical design, and if there's any more switches that you might need to add to the system. For the deployment filter, this is a way to give your leaf switches preference over the other to have configuration template apply based on some matching condition. I'm not going to go into too much detail of that. Just want to make you aware. And again, if you're not sure, click on this help icon to get more information. Endpoint tracker. This is where you can pull up connection histories of an endpoint when it connects or disconnects from the network. It will tell you basically the historical data of the endpoints being present in the fabric. And visualization is used to display traffic statistics between leaf switches to help you identify any congestions or any packet drops. And these menus right here will come back and revisit when we get to the monitoring and troubleshooting videos. There will show you some examples with the actual traffic going, once we have the traffic going through our fabric. Right now we don't really have anything to show you with. The last menu available is apps, and I believe this just got added recently too. So app or app center is where you can upload an app and have it run on APIC. There's some apps you can download from Cisco, or you can even develop one yourself. And this just help with the whole automation thing. It's just happened that you can host the app on the APIC. And finally, let's switch our attentions to our tray icon right here. On the top right, you got the name or your own name or the user that you're currently logged in with. The magnifier icon is a search icon. You can perform a search on the GUI by selecting the categories and then type your search phrase. Okay, the alert icons, this icon right here will flash, and I think we saw it briefly in the last video when our APIC cluster did not satisfy the minimum requirement. Right. When you see that flash, then you definitely need to pay attention to that. Usually it alerts you on unresolved critical errors. Right now we don't have anything, so it's all happy and not flashing. User profile, this is where you can manage your own user profile with this change password, change the key or certificate, view my permission, which we'll look at when we get to the AAA video, some settings. And I actually do like this selection right here. Let me enable it right now. Remember tree selection. So as you work your way or work around the APIC GUI, you're going to find yourself switching back and forth between these menus a lot. And sometimes when you switch it over by default on the menus on the left-hand side, which is the navigation pane, will get collapsed back to the default position. But sometimes you want to keep that or have that remained open the way that you left it last time. So that's the knobs right here that you can enable to remember the tree selections. Yep, and there's some other ones as well. Default page size for the table, if 15 is too little for you, then you can increase that. And I believe we disable what's new at the login. There's a little pop-up that said what's new in this version, I believe, and we disable that. For the gear icon, it's just a link to help page or additional documentations. There's some links that goes to things like API Inspector as well, which becomes very useful when you get into the whole REST APIs programmability side of APIC. We'll definitely come back and look at that, and there's some tools or menus for remote locking. Store Browser is the other one that's useful as well to look up the objects or manage objects on the managed information tree. And there's some show debugs output, and then about, obviously, that tells you the version that we are currently running on the APIC. Right, 301K. And finally is the tutorial link. You can click into that and it provides you with an on-screen tutorial. Let's say that you want to create tenants and you click on that. It just provides on-screen a step-by-step walkthrough how to do a specific task, and you can just follow it. Yep, there you go. To create tenant, you click tenant and then just follow that. And there's different module covering basic configuration tasks, right? Like create bridge domain VRF, register your switch, and a bunch more. Again, a very good learning tools if you're new to ACI. All right, I believe you were able to cover pretty much the majority of the web interface on the APIC, although there's a certain section we didn't go into too much detail just because we have dedicated lab videos for those. But at least this should give you a pretty good idea of how the APIC GUIs are laid out and where you go to configure certain things. Like you go to tenants to configure all the logical configuration and the fabric access policy for all the physicals. All right, and there might be some other things that I might forgot to mention on this videos, but as we make our way through the configurations in terms of other submenus, like things like this, you can click on the GUI, we'll see how to use them. And we'll definitely make sure we mention that when we get a chance to use it. Alright, that wraps up our video on ACI Introduction to the APIC Web Interface. The next video is going to be on out-of-band management configuration, I believe. And that's where we're going to start making real configuration on the APIC. You can visit our website to view an extensive list of our lab videos and sign up to get access to additional lab contents. Thank you for watching labmiss.com, and I'll see you guys in the next video.